Welcome back to Train Signal. You are watching the second part of the video for Lab 5, Single Master Operation Roles in benbrady.com. In this video, I will discuss what is known as a Single Master Operation Roles, also known as FSMO roles. We will talk about what these roles are, how do you view which domain controller has what roles, and then finally, I'll teach you how to manage those roles by performing a transfer and then performing a seize operation. So let's get started with this topic. So what is a single master operations role? Let's go back to our network diagram, and we have three domain controllers in our network, benandbrady.com, DC1, DC2, and DC3. And these are considered practically peers of each other's. In other words, I can go to any domain controller, perform a change such as create a new user or change some user's password, and that change will be replicated to all the other domain controllers in a domain. So unlike in Windows NT, the replication over here is what is known as multi-master. You can go to any domain controller, perform the change, all the domain controllers will participate in replication process, and then any changes that have taken place on any domain controllers will be reflected on each and every domain controller in the domain. On the other hand, in Windows NT, all the changes were performed on the read-write copy of the database, of the security database, and that copy resided on the NT PDC, or the primary domain controller. The backup domain controller simply got a copy from there. So the replication was single master, everything was on the PDC, and then the PDC replicated the change to all the BDCs. Well, in this multi-master replication model, there are certain changes that is impractical to perform on all the domain controllers. So what they've done is they have created what is known as a flexible single master operations role, meaning that even though these domain controllers are peers of each other, actually they're not all equals. There are some domain controllers that have a greater role or have a greater responsibility than some of the other domain controllers. Fortunately for us, these changes cannot be viewed during normal business operations, so that during normal business operations, even if one domain controller is down, for all practical purposes, you'll be able to perform all the activities in your network without feeling the absence of that domain controller. But there are certain specific roles for which all the domain controllers, or certainly the domain controller that has that specific role, must be up and running for you to be able to perform that activity. So going to our notes over here, the operations master roles in Active Directory, there is what is known as multi-master replication, so that all domain controllers participate in the replication within the Active Directory database. All domain controllers are considered peers of each other. However, there are some changes that are impractical to perform in multi-master fashion, so that one domain controller has a greater responsibility or a greater act to perform than the other domain controllers. That particular responsibility is known as the single master operations. In other words, there are certain things that must occur on a certain domain controller. So then it becomes our responsibility to find out what those roles are and which domain controller currently has those roles, and then we can choose to transfer that role to other domain controllers simply to spread out the activities on our domain controllers. So to begin with, there are 5 operation master roles. These 5 are split into 2 components. The first is the domain wide component, and the second is the forest wide component. Let's talk about the forest wide component first. So once again, there are 5 roles. 2 of them are forest wide, and these roles are schema master role and the domain naming master role. Forest wide meaning that in the entire forest, only one domain controller can be the schema master, and only one domain controller can be the domain naming master. So once again, to understand this more clearly, let's go to this diagram. And this is a diagram of a forest that we've discussed before, in which I have 6 domains: benandbrady.com, USA, Asia, Jack and Jill, Europe, and Canada. These are 6 domains in the forest. Now, in this entire forest, only one domain controller can have the role of the schema master, and only one domain controller can have the role of what is known as the domain naming master. So let's find out what those roles are, specifically what each of those roles entails, and which domain controller currently has this role. So going back to our notes over here, let's first start with the schema master role. The domain controller that has a schema master role controls the schema for the entire forest. So what then is a schema? Schema is the definition of objects as defined in the Active Directory. So for example, when you go to the properties of a user object, you find certain properties or certain attributes that you can change, such as logon name, first name, telephone number, department, and so forth. If you would like to add other items to that particular user object, then you will have to modify the schema. Let's take an example. Let's say that you're working for a company that manufactures shoes, and during Christmas they would like to give a pair of shoes to each of their employees, and for that reason they would like to track the shoe sizes for employees. Well, the shoe size does not appear as part of the property of the user object in the Active Directory. If you would like to actually add that particular property, you will have to do some programming in the X509 language, which is the language of the Active Directory. And then the domain controller that has a schema master role must be available to take those changes, because any change that is reflected in the schema affects the entire forest. And there is only one domain controller that has this role. So once again, in ordinary, during normal operations, chances are that you will not modify the schema. And because the schema is not modified, even if this domain controller that has this role is unavailable, you will never ever feel the absence of it. However, when you're trying to change the schema, you must have the schema master role available. Let me give you two other specific examples. The next example is that of Exchange. When you install Exchange Server to add email capabilities to your network, the schema gets modified. What happens is that for each user object, a mailbox is created and an email address is created for that particular user object. So after you install Exchange, when you go to the properties of the user object, you will see that there are additional tabs for Exchange related activities. In other words, the schema has been modified. So when you install Exchange, you must have the schema master role available. In fact, you also must be either the enterprise administrator or the schema master or the schema administrator, so that you have enough rights to actually perform a change for the entire forest. So that's what a schema master role is. If you're going to modify the schema, the domain controller that has this role must be available, and this domain controller is the one that actually makes the changes, and then the changes reflected in the entire forest. So that was the first forest-wide role, namely the schema master role. The next role is the domain naming master role. I like to call this role the registrar of the forest. So going back to our diagram over here, it is possible to add, let's go back to our forest diagram over here. It is possible to add additional child domains, or to add additional domain controllers in this forest. Whenever you do that, the server that has a role of the domain naming master must be available, because it is a registrar of this entire forest, meaning that if you're going to add additional domains or domain controllers, this is the role. The domain naming master role is the role that actually registers that as part of the forest. So once again, only if you're adding or removing domains is this role significant. If you're not doing that, well, this role is not needed and you will not feel the absence of this role. So for example, if you're adding a child domain to your forest, and if the domain naming master role is unavailable, you will not be able to add the child domain. However, the regular activities in your network will go as normal. So once again, there are two forest-wide roles, meaning that there can only be one domain controller in the entire forest that can have the schema master role and the domain naming master role. Now let's find out who this domain controller is, and how do we know in Active Directory which domain controller actually got this role. So going back over here to our Active Directory forest diagram, look at it this way. When you install the first domain controller for benandbrady.com, namely when you install the domain controller DC1 and made it a domain for the benandbrady.com network, well, what you did was you actually created the first domain, and you also created the first tree and the first forest. And our definition over here clearly states that in a forest, you must have at least one domain controller, or rather, let me take that back. You must have exactly one domain controller in the entire forest that should be the schema master and the domain naming master. Well, when you installed the first domain controller, namely DC1, at that time, that was the only domain controller in the entire forest. So automatically, it got the role of both the schema master and the domain naming master. So let's see how to verify these roles. What I'm going to do is minimize the screen, and then what we will do is go and make a connection to DC1. In fact, I have the connection to DC1 open over here already, so I'm going to use that. And here we go, we are in DC1. To begin with, what we will do is we will install the additional administrative tools. Once you install Active Directory, most of the tools are installed, but there are some additional tools that you must install by going to Start Run and then typing over here admin pack.msi. Those of you who are familiar with Windows 2000, you may have done this before. What this does is this adds some additional tools that are not available in the standard installation. I'm going to click on the next button over here. And specifically the tool that allows me to view the schema is available only after I add this. Otherwise, you will see that it is not available to you. Now, because the schema role is such an important role, because the entire forest is affected by it, in fact, your entire Active Directory is, so to speak, reprogrammed because of the changes made to the schema. Microsoft has not actually created a standard tool for this. You actually have to create a new MMC and add what is known as the Active Directory schema snap-in to it. If you do not run the adminpack.msi, the schema snap-in tool is not available. Okay, at this point, as you're seeing, it is registering some DLLs, and this DLL, in fact, I just missed it. One of them was a schema management DLL that just got registered that will actually allow me to view and make changes to the schema. So I'm going to click on Finish button over here. And now let's go to Start, Run, and then create a new MMC object. So I'm going to create a new Microsoft Management Console, and then over here, I'm going to click on File, Add Remove Snap-in, and the snap-in that I'm interested in is called the Active Directory schema. There we go. Once again, this Active Directory schema snap-in will not be available unless you install adminpack.msi. So I'm going to click on the Add button over here, and that's the only one that I'm interested in. So I'm going to click on OK over here to close this box, and there is my Active Directory schema. So this is what the schema is. It is definitions of objects. One of the myths over here is that you can actually go over here and make major changes or can add additional tabs or attributes. That is not true. Most of the time, the schema is modified by what is known as an Active Directory integrated application, meaning an application that will actually go to the schema and make changes to it so that the application can work in sync with the schema. Let me give you another example of an application that does that. Before I'd given you the example of Exchange, the other application that is very commonly used in companies is the PeopleSoft's HR applications. And what the HR application does is it actually integrates with the Active Directory, so that when you create a new employee record, you're also creating a new Active Directory account at the same time. You do not have to enter your information again and again, and every time you do that, the schema over here gets modified. So what I'm going to do is select this object Active Directory schema, right click, and then over here choose this item called Operations Master. So selecting that tells me who the current schema master is. So here we go. The current schema master is DC1. All right, so DC1, the first domain controller in the domain, automatically became the schema master. So that's one verification that we have performed. I'm going to get out of this. And the next thing we're going to do is, I won't save these changes because I will not be working on a schema at all. So the second role we need to verify is the domain naming master role. And to do that, you need to go to the appropriate tool. The appropriate tool for this one is the Active Directory Domains and Trust tool. So I'm going to go to Active Directory Domains and Trust and look at it this way. What is the domain naming master? It is a registrar that affects the addition or removal of additional domains in the forest. So the domain, the tool Active Directory Domains and Trust is the one that maintains relationship in these domains. That is why you need to go to this tool. Now, having gone here, you're going to select this once again and then click on Operations Master. And this time it tells me that the domain naming master role has been assigned to the domain controller DC1. So once again, I'm going to accept that, click on the close button, and then we are out. So far what we've seen is the following, that in our forest, benandbrady.com, the first domain controller DC1 got both the roles, the schema master role and the domain naming master role. Let's go on to the other three roles that remain, namely the domain wide roles. So let's discuss that next. So going up over here, if you recall, there were 5 roles. All right, there are 5 operations master roles. 2 of them are forest wide, and the remaining 3 are what is known as domain wide roles, meaning that in the entire domain, only one domain controller can have these 3 roles. So these roles are the relative identifier roles, or also known as the red master, the primary domain controller or the PDC emulator role, and last but not the least is the infrastructure master. So let's discuss this a little bit further. I'm going to go to our network diagram over here. This time I'm not showing you the forest diagram, I'm only showing you the diagram for the network benandbrady.com. In this network there are 3 domain controllers, DC1, DC2 and DC3. The first domain controller for the Ben and Brady network was DC1, and according to our discussion over here, there should be exactly one domain controller at any time that should have the 3 domain wide roles. So when DC1 became the first domain controller for this domain, automatically it got the 3 domain-wide roles. In other words, at this point, DC1 has all the 5 roles simply because it is the root of the forest and the root of the tree and the root of the domain itself. In other words, it is the first domain controller that created all these different Active Directory configurations. So let's see what these roles are. Going back to the first role over here, namely the relative ID master role. This is how the relative ID master works. Every time you create a new object in the Active Directory, for example, let's say that you create a new group. The group is given a name, which is English, so that we can understand it well. In the background, each of these objects is given what is known as a relative ID. This is what is known as a SID ID or a security identifier that uniquely identifies that object in the entire domain or in the entire forest, so to speak. So just like with us, we have a name. However, as far as the IRS and for most other financial records is concerned, we are always recognized by a social security number. If we die, the social security number is never reused again. The same happens in the Active Directory. Just to make sure that objects are uniquely identified, there is a number known as a SID that is assigned to each of these objects. Now, here's where the issue comes in. Remember, in Windows 2003 domain replication, everything is multi-master. So what can happen is that you can create a group object on any of these domain controllers. Let me take you to the other diagram here. You can create the group object on any of these 3 domain controllers. However, you should be able to uniquely identify what this object is and which domain controller actually created it. So just to keep things in sync and just to keep it simple so that everybody can understand exactly what's going on and who created this object, what happens is the following. There is something known as a RID or the relative ID. The domain controller that has that RID assigns a group of 10 to 15 IDs to each domain controller at one time. So in other words, what the RID master will do is assign, going back to our diagram over here, the RID master will assign, that's not the right one. The RID master, which is DC1, will assign 10 to 15 IDs to DC2 and 10 to 15 IDs to DC3. Now once it assigns these IDs, DC2, every time it creates a user object, will create an ID, will create those SIDs that were assigned to it, and DC3 will use those SIDs as well. And then once they are running low on that, let's say when they are up to 2 or 3 SIDs only, they will go back to DC1, and DC1 will assign them more SIDs to each of these domain controllers. So DC1 basically takes the role of the head cashier, where if the cache boxes over here are getting empty, it will actually take a certain amount of SIDs and allocate it to DC2 and DC3. Now where does this word RID come in, or the relative ID comes in? What happens is the following. Each time a domain controller assigns an ID or a SID to a particular object, that particular ID is a combination of some ID that is assigned to that domain controller plus the ID that was given by the RID master to that domain controller. So in other words, what happens is that each time a user object is created or a group object is created, the SID basically can tell you a story as to which domain controller actually created it, and also make sure that it is unique because the same domain controller, namely the RID master, is assigning IDs to everybody else. Let's take an example of a phone number. Let's say the phone number is 312-555-1212. We know that the first three numbers, 312, actually is the area code, and in fact it happens to be the area code for downtown Chicago. So the first three numbers tells you which area this particular telephone belongs to. In a similar manner, the numbers that you see in the SID have some story behind it. The numbers basically say which domain it belongs to, which domain controller actually gave out that number, and so forth, and yet it is maintained unique. So the RID master is simply a domain controller that manages the SIDs for all the domain controllers in a domain. Now, as long as each of the domain controllers have enough SIDs to allocate to user objects as they are created, this RID master role will not be missed if it is unavailable. However, when they start running out of SIDs, they have to contact the RID master, and the RID master, being unavailable, will not be able to give out those SIDs, and you will see that suddenly you cannot create new user objects even though there are some domain controllers that are up and running. Also, if you're moving user objects from one domain to another, so let's say you take the user object from one child domain USA to another child domain Europe, you must have the domain controller that has this RID master role for that domain available in order to perform this activity. So moving a user object from one OU to another does not play this role because you're within the same domain. But if you're moving a user object from one domain to another, or any object, any Active Directory object for that matter, you must have the RID master role available in order for you to accomplish that change. The next role is the PDC emulator role. And again, you can have only one domain controller in the entire domain that can have this role. This role is perhaps the most significant and the most visible role that is present in Active Directory. Let's discuss this. Let's say that in our network over here, just let's assume that DC1 and DC2 are Server 2003 computers, and DC3 is a Windows NT backup domain controller. So once again, DC1 and DC2 are Server 2003 domain controllers. DC3 is an NT backup domain controller, namely BDC. Now, in the Windows NT environment, the replication was single master operations. In other words, the replication was single master replication. In other words, DC3, which is a BDC, looks forward to a PDC. In other words, it has to look as to who the PDC is, contacts it, and gets the objects in the security database in its own database. So in this particular case, when you have DC1 and DC2 coexisting with DC3, which is an NT computer, this DC3 should be able to look at one of these domain controllers as a PDC. Remember, Microsoft did not go back to Windows NT and re-engineer it to make it understand what a Server 2003 Active Directory looks like. So what they did instead was it gave one of these domain controllers the role of what is known as a PDC emulator. Look at the word, PDC emulator. This domain controller DC1, which happens to be the PDC emulator for this domain, looks like a PDC to DC3. So DC3 assumes that this is the PDC for this network. It always contacts the DC1 over here to initiate the replication between DC1 and DC3. Alrighty. So without this role PDC emulator, DC3, which is an NTP BDC, would be lost, and it would not know who to contact it for a replication of the domain database. So the PDC emulator plays a key role of actually emulating the Windows NT BDCs. Now the next question you might ask is that, well, what if I finally upgrade this Windows NT BDC to Windows Server 2003? In other words, I do not have BDCs anymore. All my 3 domain controllers are Server 2003 computers. In that case, you obviously do not need that NT PDC emulator role to actually make sure that DC1 looks like a Windows NT BDC. So even though this role is not there, there is another role that the PDC emulator performs that is significant enough for you to be able to keep this role and make sure that this role is up and running at all times. Here's how the PDC emulator role performs the next activity in a totally Windows 2000 or Server 2003 environment. I'm going to explain this process with a scenario. Let's say that you go to the domain controller DC3 and change a user's password. And now when the user logs in, let's say that this user happens to be in the California site and the password was changed on the North Carolina side at that time. When the user logs in the California site, it will try to contact either DC1 or DC2 to log in. Now, let's say that it contacted DC2. So DC2 looked at the user object and found that the password actually does not match because the password was just changed over here, and in fact the replication has not yet gone from DC3 to DC2. Alright, so what happens is the following. When the user tries to log in, even though the password has changed and the user is using the new password, the user account will be rejected. And if this were to happen in a domain-wide environment where you have thousands of users, this would really be a mess where the users would have to wait for a significant amount of time so that the replication takes place. And by the way, the users don't know what the time is. In fact, the domain admins don't know what the time is in a larger environment where there are multiple domain controllers replicating with each other. So in order to avoid all this confusion, what happens is the following. Every time you make a change on a user's password on any domain controller, that change is immediately sent to the PDC emulator of that domain. So the moment that the user's password was changed on DC3, DC1 immediately was notified of the new password. Now what happens is the following. Every time a user logs on and contacts a domain controller that has not received the new password changes, what the domain controller will do is, for example, in this case, DC2 will not reject that user from logging in. In fact, what DC2 will do is it will say that, okay, your password does not match. Let me first check with the PDC emulator to see if I have the appropriate password for you. So DC2 will contact DC1. DC1 will say that, oh yeah, sure, the password was changed. However, you still don't know because replication has not taken place between us. And it will inform DC2 to allow that particular user to log in. So this avoids a lot of confusion simply because in a multi-master domain environment, you can go to any domain controller and make any of these changes. And these changes have to be replicated to all these domain controllers. And since all this does not take place within a very short period of time or instantly, there should be some mechanism that allows this from happening. And the PDC emulator role is the one that actually performs that function, making sure that the usernames and passwords are reflected across the domain. The last role is, or the third role is the infrastructure master role. This role basically is responsible for group to user references in a domain membership and the group membership as much as possible. So every time you add users to groups or change or make bulk changes to names of users or name to groups, this is the one that keeps everything in sync, ensuring that the users belong to the right groups and the groups reflect who the members are. And if you change the names of users, automatically the group membership will be reflected of that as well. So once again, you may not miss this role unless you have actually changed a lot of users and a lot of groups, and then suddenly you'll find that some of the domain controllers are not aware of these changes. So to summarize this, there are 3 domain-wide roles: RID master, which is responsible for allocating SIDs; PDC emulator, that is responsible for replication in the NT-BDC environment and for preferential password changes in a total or a complete server 2000 and 2003 environment; and then the infrastructure master role, that is responsible for maintaining the relationship between users and groups. Now let's see where these roles are. If these are domain-wide roles, I need to use a tool that shows me the entire Active Directory for that domain. So I'm going to go and connect back to DC1. Let's log in. Now the tool, I'm going to close this Active Directory Domains and Trust tool over here. The tool that shows you the picture of the entire domain is Active Directory Users and Computers. So let's connect to that tool. Active Directory Users and Computers. Here we go. And now to find out these roles, what you need to do is click on your domain, because you're going to find out who has these roles in this domain. Right click on it, and here we go, Operations Master. Because I'm going to the domain and right clicking, I'm going to see the roles for this particular domain only. And here are the roles. The RID master was given to DC1. The PDC emulator role was also given to DC1. The infrastructure master role was also given to DC1 per our discussion, because DC1 happens to be the first domain controller in the benandbrady.com domain. So it got all the roles. In fact, it got all the 5 roles simply because it is the one that actually created the entire forest and the entire domain. Now, over a period of time, you may not want to keep all the roles on that particular domain controller DC1. So now it's time to talk about managing these roles. In other words, at this point, DC1 becomes a significantly important domain controller, and it is because it is the root of the entire forest. It has all 5 roles. Over a period of time, administrators like to spread out these roles to other domain controllers so that in the absence of one domain controller, all these roles suddenly do not become unavailable. So let me show you how to do that. In our case, what we're going to do is the following. We will transfer the role of infrastructure master from DC1 to DC2. Alright, so in order to do that, what you need to first do is connect to the domain controller DC2 in order to transfer this role. So what I'm going to do is the following. There are 2 ways of doing this. One of the ways is I can actually minimize this and make a connection to DC2 over here, because then I'll be sitting on DC2 and then I can easily transfer this role. However, you can do it from DC1 itself, and I'm going to show you that method. So over here, sitting on DC1, you're actually looking at the Active Directory as seen from DC1's perspective. Now what I'm going to do is right click on benandbrady.com, and over here use this method called connect to domain controller. So I'm going to select this, and this time I'm going to say don't connect to DC1, in fact connect me to DC2. And then click on, oops, let me just reposition this window a little bit better, and click on the OK button over here. So now I'm looking at the Active Directory Users and Computers in DC1 itself. So that way I don't have to change my screen over here. Alright, it is important that you do that because you have to be in that domain controller that's actually going to make the transfer for you to be able to accomplish the step. Now in order to transfer the role, we're going to transfer the infrastructure master role. So you need to click on benandbrady.com, right click, and then over here I'm going to say over here Operations Master, and let's go to the infrastructure master role over here. Okay, now over here it says who currently has it, DC1. And over here it's saying that, well, if you want to transfer it to DC2, click on the change button. The reason it brought up DC2 over here is because of what I did before. I already connected to DC2, so it's already prepared that, well, I want to transfer it from DC1 to DC2. So let's click on the change button over here. And it's asking me, are you sure you want to transfer? Also, this transfer is a keyword. There are 2 methods. I'll speak about the other method. And this method is also is known as the transfer method. I'm going to click on yes. And it says that the operations master role was successfully transferred. I'm going to click on OK, and then I'm going to close this tool. In fact, what I'm going to do is close the entire tool, and let's go back to domain controller 1. Actually, I'm on domain controller 1. Let's go back to Active Directory users and computers, because now I'm using this tool on DC1 itself, not on DC2. Just so that to show you that this role was actually reflected, or this change was reflected in the entire domain. So here we go. Read master is still DC1, PDC master is still DC1. However, the infrastructure master is being changed to DC2. If you go to any domain controller in this network, this change will be reflected. It's a major change, and this change gets reflected immediately from one domain controller to another. So what I showed you is one of the methods of managing FSMO roles, namely the transfer method. In fact, there are two methods. So going back over here to our notes, I'm going to go back over here. Managing operations master roles, there are two methods. One is what is known as a transfer method, and the other one is what is known as a seize method. What we just performed was a transfer method. The transfer method can be performed with the cooperation of the current owner. In other words, DC1 was up and running, so I was able to transfer the role of the the infrastructure master from DC1 to DC2 simply because DC1 was up and running. Now we have a problem with this method. One of the problems is that, as you saw, that I had to actually connect to DC2 to be able to transfer the role. So I'm assuming that DC2 is up and running, and and DC1 is up and running, and I can take the role from DC1 and then give it to DC2. Well, let's say at this point DC2 is the one that has the infrastructure master role. And let's say that DC2 suddenly becomes unavailable because of a hard disk failure, or there's something wrong with the hardware, and it will never ever come up again. Again, that is important. If you can actually fix a domain controller and perhaps even restore from backup, you should not perform the next activity known as the seizing activity. If you know for a fact that this domain controller will never ever come up, that is when you actually move to perform this drastic measure known as seizing the operations master role. So in other words, the two roles are transfer and seize. Transfer is done with the cooperation of the current owner. Seizing is done when the owner is not available and you have no choice but to take away that role and forcibly give it to some other domain controller. So what I'm going to do is simulate that environment. What I'm going to do is connect to DC1, and then on DC1, which currently has this role, by the way, what we're going to do is we're going to shut down DC2. So I'm on DC2 now, and I'm going to shut down this domain controller. Once this domain controller, what I'm doing is simulating, here we go, we're going to lose a remote desktop connection. What I'm doing is simulating the fact that DC2 for some reason is not available, and we had already transferred the infrastructure master role to DC2, so now we need to get it back. So let's see how to perform this activity. So what I'm going to do is minimize the screen and go back to our domain controller, DC1, that is still up and running. And now to perform this activity, you need to use a tool known as ntdsutil, and that is run from the command prompt. So I'm going to connect to the command prompt. Just rearrange my screen over here a little bit. Okay, so I'm on a blank screen, and the first command that you will type is ntdsutil. We'll be typing a series of these commands, and this activity is also in the lab book with all the steps. So here we go. That's the first command, ntdsutil. Now over here, I need to type the keyword roles and hit on enter, and it's asking me for the for the activity that we're going to perform, the FSMO maintenance role over here. So over here, what I'm going to do is type the word connections, and I'll explain why we are doing this, and hit enter. Now it's asking me for server connections. Remember, when we perform the transfer operation, we have to actually connect to DC2 to perform the transfer. Well, over here what I'm saying is that, well, connect me to a certain domain controller that will actually take away this role that I would like to take away or seize. So in our case, what we're going to do is seize this role from DC2 to DC1. So what I need to do is make a connection to DC1. So in order to do that, you need to type the following command. The command is connect to server, and then over here you have to give it the full name for the server, which is dc1.benandbrady.com. I think I've typed that okay. Let's click on the enter button again, and it's trying to make a connection to the server, and actually has already done so. Now over here it's asking me for additional connections. I do not want to do that, so I'm going to type the quit command. In other words, we have connected and we have accomplished the server connections at this point. I'm back on the FSMO maintenance role. Now over here, I need to type the following command. I'm going to type the word seize to take away this role. And this is a simple command. All you have to do is type the word seize and the role that you would like to seize. In our case, we would like to seize the role infrastructure master. Okay, if you're seizing the PDC emulator role, you will type the word PDC emulator over here. And now hit the enter button. And it's warning me or letting me know that I'm actually going to perform the seize operation. And also please note one more time that if DC2 is going to come up soon, do not seize it away. This is a drastic measure you use only when you know for a fact that that particular domain controller cannot be brought up again. So I'm going to click on the yes button over here. Now it's attempting to save transfer infrastructure roles before seizure. It will take a few minutes, and then eventually it will transfer the role to me, and then we will go to Active Directory users and computers and actually check out that DC1 has the role of infrastructure master one more time. So let's give it a few minutes while it's performing this activity, and then we'll go and check. And the key difference between seizing and transfer is that in order to transfer, you must have the other domain controller available. It has to be done with the cooperation of that domain controller. Seizing means you are forcibly seizing it away. Microsoft loves to ask questions on this topic a lot in their exams. So make sure you know this topic very well, what the roles are, who's got that role, and so forth. Okay, I think it has performed the activity at this point, and then we are done with this. So I'm going to type the command quit to get out of this, and then type quit one more time. And we are back to our command prompt. So clear the screen. Let's close this command prompt, and then go back to Active Directory users and computers and see who has the role of infrastructure master currently. So going back over here. I'm going to right click on benandbrady.com, go to operations master, and then here's the infrastructure master. There we go. We got a role back from DC2 forcibly by performing the seize operation. So those were the 5 roles, and you saw what the significance of each role is and how they work together in sync with each other. Also, please note that if one of these roles is unavailable, you may not feel the absence of that immediately, and that is good by design, so that you can perform most of the activities on domain controllers that currently exist. Only when you want to perform specific actions like adding a new domain to the forest, and for example the domain naming role is not available, will you have a problem with that. That also concludes this video. In this video, I explained to you what the single master operations roles are. We saw how to verify these operations master roles. We saw how to actually perform the transfer, and last but not the least, in case the other domain controller is not available, I showed you how to actually seize the role from that domain controller using the NTDS utility. I thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you very soon in a different video by Train Signal.